Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be all about Barabbas. If you don't know who Barabbas is, that's okay, because nobody does. There are quite a few apocryphal stories about him, but as is usually the case, these stories have no basis in historical fact and are nothing more than fiction created by booksellers, Hollywood, and the religions of the empire as a means of distracting spiritual people from discovering vital truths recorded in the Barabbas story. By the time you finish watching this video, you will know as much or more about Barabbas than anyone else alive. Most of what you will hear has not been revealed to mankind in 2,000 years. As I often like to remind people, the Bible is not a rule book for how to get to heaven, but is simply a written history of the war between God's kingdom and Satan's empire. The war between the righteous angels and the wicked angels, or to put it another way, the war between creation and civilization. When Jesus was sacrificed, he was not alone. His death was part of a much larger event. We are not told how many were sacrificed by the empire on that particular day, but when we take into account how God feels about murder, we can rightfully say that to date the number of those who have been sacrificed in order to maintain civilization's demonic pyramid scheme would be in the millions. From its founding, civilization has always demanded absolute obeisance. For nearly 6,000 years, assimilation, incarceration, and extermination have been the only options available to mankind. It is understandable that so many would choose assimilation over the other two options. It is very likely that the number sacrificed on that day would have been greater than usual. Rome had a reputation for doing things in a big way. Thousands of the citizens of the nation would have been in town for the Passover festival, and as the Bible says at Matthew chapter 27 and verse 15, releasing a condemned man had become a traditional part of Passover. If we take into consideration just what this verse says in its original languages, then there is no way around the fact that ritual human sacrifice had by this time become an integral part of the Passover celebration. It's only logical to conclude that the number of public executions would have been greater during the holidays. In or around 597 BC, Babylon conquered and carried off into captivity the remaining two tribes of the once powerful nation, and the Bible clearly states that when the remnant of survivors eventually returned, they would no longer be directly ruled by God, but instead under the governmental authority of Satan. Although loosely based on the religion that Moses had given to the people in the wilderness hundreds of years earlier, the Judaism of Jesus' day would be more like the religion of modern Judaism. Moses would never have recognized the rituals being performed by the Jews in the first century. Timing the ritual human sacrifices being performed in Jerusalem to coincide with the religious festivals of the Jews would have drawn in a greater number of tourists. But ritual human sacrifice would not have been simply a means of improving the economic impact of Passover. By the first century, ritual human sacrifice was the Passover. If what I'm telling you sounds far-fetched, it's only because of thousands of years of religious propaganda. Israel was an integral part of the Roman Empire. It had ceased to be a sovereign nation over 600 years earlier. At that time, Rome controlled all of the known world. The system used by Rome to win the hearts of the people of the nations that it conquered at that time was known as panem et circenses, which translates as bread and circuses, and it is undisputed common knowledge that the most popular form of entertainment provided by the Roman circuses always involved some form of public execution. As a people, the citizens of Judea were no different than any other province of Rome. The vast majority of Judea's citizens enjoyed the entertainment provided by the empire. We do know from the information recorded in the Bible that on that particular day at least 4 victims were scheduled for execution. When Jesus was impaled, there were at least 2 others being impaled on either side of him, and we are told about Barabbas, who was scheduled for execution but was released as part of the festivities. According to our English Bibles, Barabbas was a murderer and a thief, but in the original language of the New Testament, he was in fact what we today might call a freedom fighter. One of the words used to describe him is lestes. This word is consistently translated as thief or robber in every Bible that I have ever read. But outside of the English Bible, it is never translated as thief. It is more than obvious that the church's translators know what this word means, and the fact that they all consistently mistranslate this word is a pretty good indication that, once again, the churches are trying to hide something. In the works of Josephus, this word is consistently translated as revolutionary. Lestes would more accurately be understood in modern English as insurgent, terrorist, revolutionary, rebel, or resistance fighter. The church's tradition of translating lestes as thief is intentionally misleading. There can be no doubt that people back then complained about the Roman authority. They, just like the people today, recognized that civilization's hierarchy was oppressive, but many benefited from that oppression, or at least believed that they did. Such people were willing to not only tolerate the arrangement, but in most instances were willing to fight to the death to defend it. The Bible calls such people Herodians, which translates as supporters of the heroic. Today, such people are often referred to in the English language as patriots. Many Bible stories that repeat over and over again are reenactments of past historic events and pre-enactments of future historic events. We are about to witness with our own eyes the final playing out of the story of Barabbas in the very near future. And understanding the significance of this story before the great day of the Lord may be crucial if we wish to recognize these events for what they are. To understand the Bible account of Jesus' execution and the role that Barabbas played, we're going to have to look at similar stories in other parts of the Bible. Jesus' sacrifice was one of the most significant events to have ever taken place in all of human history, but it is important to understand that his death was not some kind of standalone cure-all for humanity's ills, but part of a repeating pattern of ritual blood sacrifices, each and every one essential for the salvation of mankind. It's also important to understand that his sacrifice would not be the last, and in fact the single most significant sacrifice in all of human history has yet to take place. Much of the information that I will be covering in this video has already been posted in much greater detail as parts of other videos that I have produced over the years. In this video, I will leave links to those videos. It would be very beneficial to anyone listening to this information to take the time to listen to the more detailed information in those other videos. The very first blood shed recorded in the Bible took place shortly after Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden. Cain and Abel were at the entrance of the garden attempting to get back into paradise by making sacrifices. According to the Bible, another aspect of the war between creation and civilization is the involvement of human beings in this war. Cain was a builder. Cain had been planning on creating the world's first population center, which he eventually did. As a result, he tried to gain entry by sacrificing some of his agricultural products. Unlike Cain, Abel, his brother, was what the Bible calls a shepherd. He was trying to gain entry by sacrificing some of the animals of his flock. At Genesis chapter 46 and verse 34, the occupation of the sons of Jacob is described as shepherds of flocks, ra'ason, which would more accurately be translated as caretakers of migrating animals. From the story of Cain and Abel to the book of Revelation, the struggle between the shepherds and builders would be a recurring theme. Throughout the Bible, Jesus is spoken of as both a shepherd and as a sacrificial lamb. As the story of Cain and Abel goes, God accepted Abel's sacrifice while rejecting Cain's sacrifice, which led to Cain killing his brother. Abel's sacrifice of his firstlings made it possible for him to gain temporary entry back into the paradise that his parents had been forced out of. The sacrifice of his own life would have gained him an eventual permanent entry into paradise. Abel, like Jesus, was both a shepherd and a sacrificial victim. When Cain sacrificed his brother's life, he did so to protect something very precious to himself: civilization. Currently, nearly every indigenous man, woman, and child that has ever attempted to live by natural law has been sacrificed. In one way or another, we have, for the most part, all been forced into Satan's fictional version of self-determination. The next sacrifice mentioned in the Bible took place when Noah and his family exited the ark into a world washed clean by the global deluge. Noah's family was all that remained of humanity. Their sacrifice would have allowed them to once again enter into a paradise similar to that entered into by Abel years earlier. All animal sacrifices conducted in the Bible were done in acknowledgement of the fact that before mankind could re-enter paradise, sacrifices would have to be made. After the flood, conditions deteriorated as people once again chose to leave off from shepherding living things and instead become builders. Under the rulership of Nimrod, construction began on several cities, the most well-known being Babylon. God approached a man who would eventually come to be known as Abraham and told him that he wanted to take him to an unusual place. Abraham agreed, and 40 years later he and his tribe entered into what we today call the land of milk and honey, the Promised Land, or the Holy Land. Being described as the land of milk and honey was indicative of the fact that year-round the mammals were producing offspring while the plants were producing pollen. Such verses have nothing to do with God's version of any kind of holy or healthy diet. Once again, just as in the case of Abel and Noah, Abraham would be entering a paradise. As Abraham approached the land, he stopped twice prior to entering the land to build altars in order to conduct 2 separate ritual blood sacrifices. Later, he was forced out of the Promised Land, but when he returned, he stopped once again prior to making entry in order to conduct another blood sacrifice. This was repeated later by his son Isaac, and even later by Isaac's son Jacob. Each left the land in a different direction and returned from a different direction. But if we mark the locations of each of their sacrifices on a map, those sacrifices would encircle the spot where Jesus himself would be sacrificed years later. Once again, all of these sacrifices were in acknowledgement of the fact that prior to humanity re-entering paradise, sacrifices would have to be made. Jacob, whose name means grabber of the heel, which itself means usurper, eventually changed his name to Israel, which means contender with God. His offspring eventually grew in number so great that they became a nation. As time went on, this nation became the foundation of the slave labor force of the Egyptian Empire, but was rescued by God and over time brought into the land which had previously been occupied by the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And once again, before entering the land, a blood sacrifice was made. This nation would be used by God in a very special way to prove once and for all that civilization, no matter how well-intentioned, simply cannot work. And once again, the sacrifice performed prior to entering the Promised Land was a reminder to all of humanity that prior to re-entering paradise, sacrifices would have to be made. During the journey, the nation was given the opportunity to live according to natural law, just as their original parents Adam and Eve had been given in the very beginning, free of the three elements that make up every empire that Satan has ever established: government, economics, and religion. According to God's natural law, which we today call the Ten Commandments, no more sacrifices would be required. God's law was immediately rejected by the people. As an alternative, God decided to give them just what they wanted: a governmental, economic, and religious law code, in the form of hundreds of seemingly arbitrary rules governing every petty aspect of Jewish life. But far from being arbitrary, these rules were established to act as clues, allowing us to understand other profound yet confusing events that took place in the Bible narrative, as well as events that will take place in the very near future. In order to consecrate a priesthood to administer that law, the male members of the tribe of Levi were required to perform ritual human sacrifices. The Levites eagerly complied, once again in acknowledgement of the fact that sacrifices would have to be made prior to re-entering paradise. One of the confusing laws given to the nation by Moses involved what we today call the scapegoat. According to the Bible book of Leviticus, 2 rams were to be brought before the priest. He was to lay his hands on them, and lots were to be cast. One was to be sacrificed by bloodletting, and the other was to be exiled into the wilderness to carry away the sins of the nation. The goat to be sacrificed was, as the Bible says, to be for the Lord, and the goat to be exiled into the wilderness was to be for Azazel. Some English Bibles translate Azazel as scapegoat or goat of departure. Neither translation is entirely accurate, and in fact the twisting of these verses have been just misleading enough to help to keep mankind in spiritual darkness for over 2,000 years. If we look at the two words translated as the Lord and transliterated as Azazel, it is not all that difficult to figure out what is being communicated to us in these verses. What is actually said is that the goat being slaughtered was for Eowah, which most Bibles by tradition translate as the Lord, although some render this word as either Jehovah or Yahweh. A literal translation of this word, Eowah, would actually be to be. Azazel in these verses is not translated at all in most Bibles, but is left as it would be in the original language, transposed letter for letter into an English-looking and sounding version of the original word. According to most church reference materials, Azel means removed, and adding an extra oz at the beginning of the word indicates that Azazel means utterly removed, completely removed, or forcefully removed. I think that this is a very important aspect of the word, but does not reveal who Azazel is or what this very important verse was meant to convey to mankind. Eowah was the recognized God of the Jews, an actual living being, the creator of everything. By simple logic, we should be able to conclude that Azazel would likely have been some powerful living being in some way associated with Eowah. Since the word El, as used in the Bible, means God, whether the true God, the gods of the nations, a righteous angel, an unrighteous angel, or even an acknowledged powerful human ruler, we should immediately recognize that the El at the end of Azazel means God. The word Oz on its own would translate as rough, as in harsh, uncomfortable, or even brutal. Azazel would have to be one of the main characters spoken of throughout the Bible. In this instance, he is being referred to as the harsh god of the harsh gods, the God in opposition to Eowah, the true God, the God to be. Outside of the Bible, the only references to Azazel are found in the book of Enoch, where it is recorded that one of the fallen angels is named Azazel, and in the Apocalypse of Abraham, where Azazel is the name of an unclean bird that attempted to steal the sacrifice made by Abraham in the book of Genesis. What was done annually in this religious ritual would mirror what was to be done to Jesus and Barabbas. And once again, we can determine this by examining the original ancient language words used in the Bible account involving Barabbas, from which our English Bibles were supposedly translated. In our English Bibles, the religious leaders of the Jews accused Jesus of sedition. Barabbas has been accused of sedition as well. Pilate, by tradition, would allow one person sentenced to death to go free every Passover, and rather than picking which prisoner to free himself, he would allow the choice to be made randomly by the Jewish people, very much like the casting of lots over the two goats. When he offered to release Jesus, called the Christ, the people rejected him, but instead asked for Barabbas. As is recorded in the original language, what was actually said was, "Who would you like me to release to you? Iosaus ton Barabbas or Iosaus ton Lego Christos?" If we were to translate this passage in a fashion similar to the way that the rest of the Bible is translated, it would be rendered as, "Who would you choose for me to release? Jesus, the Son of the Father, or Jesus, who is called the Chosen One?" Initially, when the Catholic Church translated this passage into Latin, it was decided that Barabbas be left untranslated, as is common with proper names, as opposed to translating it as Son of the Father. But in these verses, the definite article "the" is present, which would translate as the Barabbas. The word "the" would not be placed before a proper name. Why his first name, Jesus, was removed is actually recorded by secular history. Origen, one of the early church fathers, declared that Jesus could not possibly be the name of a thief, hence leaving his name in the Bible would be heresy. As a powerful leader of Satan's empire at that time, Origen was able to keep all references to the fact that Jesus was Barabbas' actual name from being included in any copies of the Bible produced by the Catholic Church after that time. Fortunately for us, many early Greek language texts still exist, confirming that in the original language, Barabbas' actual name was in fact Jesus. It should not surprise us that the churches would put so much effort into deceiving us about the nature of Barabbas or Azazel. The fact that they are deceiving us about both is just one more reason for us to come to the conclusion that the two are somehow related. In our English Bibles, Joshua and Jesus are simply the same word in two different languages. Iosaus is simply the Hellenized Babylonian equivalent of the ancient Hebrew word Yahshua. Iosaus in the New Testament is usually transliterated as Jesus, while Yahshua in the Old Testament is usually transliterated as Joshua. It was Joshua that brought Israel into the Promised Land, the land of milk and honey, the paradise garden of God. It is Jesus that will bring us into the future eternal paradise of God. Most so-called Christians acknowledge that the sacrifice of Jesus Christ was necessary for our salvation, but are not aware of the fact that the releasing of Jesus Barabbas into exile was necessary as well. According to most sources, Jesus and Joshua both mean salvation of Jehovah. A more accurate definition would be salvation of Jah. Jesus is transliterated from Iosaus, not Iowasaus. Joshua is transliterated from Yahshua, not Yahwashua. In both words, the future tense part of the word is absent. When civilization's final sacrifice is made, we will no longer refer to our Father as Eowah, future tense, but as Yah, present tense. As the Roman Empire eventually fell and Satan chose to move his throne to Britain, several of the human rulers that he put into place made the task of translating the Bible into the English language a priority. Each and every one of them chose to follow the policy initiated by the Roman Empire of removing the actual name of Barabbas. King Henry VIII produced a rather rare and relatively short-lived version in 1539. King James I in 1611 produced another version which circulated for a little over 150 years, and King George III in 1767 produced the single most popular English version of the Bible ever, which almost 250 years later is very likely the best-selling book in all of human history. The authorized version produced by King George was named after King James I, who had authorized the previous English version of the Bible. It was sometime between the reign of Gregory XIII of Rome and James I of England that England replaced Rome as the seat for Satan's empire. Many so-called Christians consider the British Empire's authorized English version of the Bible to be the only true word of God, despite the fact that the current version is named after one of the most evil men to have ever lived. History records that Henry and James were both insanely evil, while George himself was simply insane. Out of respect for the traditions of men and a lack of respect for truth, most English translations still conform to the Empire's version of the Bible by leaving out the name of Jesus, Son of the Father. A while back, I made the statement that all English translations of the Bible were nothing more than clones of the King James Bible produced by George III. But I produced a video series a while back in which I explained which of the King James clones I considered to be superior. While researching this video, I was only able to find 3 Bibles out of the dozens available to me that restored Barabbas' name. 2 of those 3 are on my list of recommended Bibles. The NIV, also known as the New International Version, as well as the TEV, also known as the Today's English Version, or Good News Bible, GNT. Although both have restored Jesus as Barabbas' actual name, neither have chosen to translate the words ton Barabbas as the Son of the Father. But I have learned not to expect too much from Bible translators. When I posted that video series, quite a few people took offense that I would recommend either of those Bibles over the King James Version. I am reasonably certain that a few of them will speak up again in defense of church policy, but that's okay. Very soon God will do away with religion forever, and when that happens, I am certain that people will be much more accepting of truth. That being said, my favorite all-time English translation of the Bible currently is still the ESV, also known as the English Standard Version. Unfortunately, the ESV follows church tradition by leaving the name of Barabbas out. Now that I have explained the basics, I'm going to explain what it all means. When given the choice of who to release, the Jews all cried out for Barabbas. When Pilate asked if instead they would accept Jesus, who is called the Chosen One, the Jews refused. Many people recognize that they do not benefit from being ruled over by selfish, wicked, powerful men. Over the thousands of years that humanity has spent enslaved to the empire, many have attempted to resist that enslavement. The Bible makes no qualms about the fact that Barabbas was an insurgent. He actively resisted the Roman authority, even to the point of violence. The Bible strongly advises against such activities, but at the same time makes it clear that the true rulers of human society are not human at all. Jesus knew that civilization was evil, and he was more than aware of the fact that the Roman Empire was directly ruled by Satan, just as the current ruling world empire is today. He never voluntarily gave his allegiance to the empire, and yet he never actively took a stand against it either. He understood that the time that his Father had granted to Satan and his followers for ruling over the earth was limited, and would one day run out. He also knew that prior to that time there would be nothing that humanity could do to put an end to Satan's reign. When asked by Pilate if he was the king of the Jews, Jesus made it clear that his authority was in no way associated with the political systems of man. The rebels obviously wanted Barabbas released because he espoused their desire for self-rule separate from the Roman authority. But according to the Bible, all of the people called for the release of Barabbas, including the Herodians, who believed in the Roman version of self-rule. As different as those patriots and insurgents were, they were able to overlook their differences long enough to stand united in their struggle for independence from rulership by God. People in the first century were no different than people today. The Herodians back then, just like the so-called patriots in our day, certainly believed that their empire had God's blessing. Those lacetastes who violently stood against it, just like so-called insurgents in our day, felt the same way. When Jesus was arrested, even Peter took a stand. According to our English Bibles, Peter drew his sword. The actual Greek word used here is makeda, which would be about an 18-inch knife. The Greek word makeda is where we get our English word machete. At the time, Jesus' followers only had 2 of these machetes, and whoever was holding the other one did not draw his. What Peter did was honorable. Jesus was about to suffer an incredible injustice. It was Jesus who had told Peter to acquire a machete. So many wonder why Jesus would seemingly change his policy when Peter finally had the opportunity to use it. There are actually 2 reasons as to why Jesus stopped Peter from defending him. The first one is found at John 18:11, when after telling Peter to return his sword to its sheath, he asked him, "Should I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" God's Word, the Bible, contains many prophecies about Jesus' death. God said it, so it was going to happen. Unbeknownst to Peter, his attempt at rescuing Jesus from the Romans would have been an attempt at hindering Bible prophecy. Peter's justifiable emotional response to injustice prompted Jesus to give him a subtle reminder as to why his Father sent him. Secondly, it should be more than obvious that Peter was not going to defeat the Roman army with his knife. A knife can be a very good defensive weapon against an attacker, but not when the attacker is an army of trained soldiers with superior weapons. The 2 men on either side of Jesus understood as they were dying that their efforts to overthrow the Roman authority had not and would not benefit them personally. Even if they believed that their deaths might benefit future generations of Jews, history records that that did not happen. At the Passover of 70 A.D., just 1 generation after the execution of Jesus, the Romans surrounded Jerusalem and, according to Josephus, slaughtered about 1 million Jews. Many who would have been present at Jesus' execution would themselves die at that same location during a very similar Passover celebration, along with the future generation that those 2 men at either side of Jesus might have thought that they were giving their lives for. Jesus, commanding his followers to acquire a sword, is indicative of the fact that God recognizes a person's right to defend themselves against an attacker. But Jesus specifically told Peter that those choosing to use weapons for any other reason were deserving of death. Only the gods of civilization require their worshippers to engage in carnal warfare. Anyone taking up arms in any criminal activity or as part of an organized fighting force cannot rightfully claim to be doing so for the true God. The potential price for participating in any of the wars of civilization, whether as a patriot or as an insurgent, has always been death. It is quite possible that those choosing the life of a soldier today, whether as a patriot or an insurgent, will soon find themselves involved in civilization's final battle. Obviously, the so-called scapegoat, Azazel, represented none other than Satan himself. When Cain killed his brother Abel at Genesis chapter 4 and verse 16, we are told that Cain, which means possession, was made an exile in the land of Nod, which translates as wandering. Abel was willing to do whatever was necessary to gain entry into God's creation. Cain was more interested in improving on that creation. If we compare the information from these two Bible accounts, it is logical to conclude that Abel represented the goat for Eowah, while Cain, who was forced into exile, represented the goat for Azazel. As the Bible says, Abel was killed for doing the will of God, while Cain was exiled for doing the will of Satan. In the very near future, the Bible says that Jesus will return, ridding the earth of evil. As Jesus himself described it, he would come as a shepherd to separate the sheep from the goats, or as would be more accurately rendered as separating the Araphon, which translates as the male stud goats, from the Probaton, which translates as the flock. This work of separating will result in the removing of Satan and his angels as represented by the goat for Azazel. When this takes place, the sins of the people will not be carried away in any figurative sense, but in fact will actually be removed from the earth. Without the presence of the wicked spirits that currently fill the citizens of Satan's civilization, humanity will no longer be motivated to engage in wicked activities. As for the role of those sacrificed for Eowah, all those who are killed at Armageddon will be part of that great final bloodletting, the single greatest mass killing in all of human history. As Revelation says, the blood will come clear up to the bridles of the horses. The wage that sin pays is death, and true to his word, when human beings choose to rule themselves, sin, and by default, death, is always the result. As Satan and his fallen angels are driven into exile, all of the revolutionaries and patriots will be violently sacrificed, similar to the way that Abel, the goat for Eowah, and even Jesus himself were sacrificed. Everyone willing to die for the right to self-rule will be given the opportunity to do so. But not everyone will die on the great day of God the Almighty. Many of Earth's inhabitants want to be ruled by God. We love the birds, fish, and animals that God has created for us to enjoy, and take seriously the admonition to ensure the safety and happiness of those creatures. To kill them and replace them with material things is offensive to us. We especially love our fellow man, including those patriots and revolutionaries who engage in carnal warfare with one another over the legal right to self-rule, and that despite the fact that they are both fighting over the right to oppress those of us who refuse to participate in their struggles. In the book of Revelation, humanity's final blood sacrifice is referred to as the Battle of Armageddon. This Greek word, is translated from the Hebrew words Har, meaning mountain, and Megiddon, meaning crowds. But there is a literal mountain of Megiddo mentioned in the Bible. There are photographs available on the internet of the ruins of the fortress that King Solomon built, although many now contend that it was built by King Ahab. I have heard religious people say that Armageddon is only a figurative battle because there are no mountains in ancient Megiddo, but that is not at all the case. The Bible was not written in English, so the English definition of the word mountain has no bearing whatsoever on our understanding of the word Armageddon. What is important is the Hebrew definition of the word Har. A har is defined in the ancient Hebrew language would be any elevated geological formation, and Solomon's fortress is located on an elevated geological formation. The word har, as used in Hebrew, can also mean any large rock, including very large rocks, such as the planets, including the earth. Calling the earth a mountain of crowds would be reasonable according to what would be linguistically acceptable in the ancient Hebrew language, especially within the context of the Bible. As Revelation chapter 16 and verse 14 says, all of the kings of the earth will be drawn to the battle of Armageddon. Currently, that literal location does not seem to be of any military significance, but we have to remember that the fallen angels are consistently referred to as the kings of the earth. So we shouldn't consider the importance of Armageddon according to human standards. And if we consider that the mountain of crowds could be a reference to the earth itself, then Armageddon quite obviously would be very significant to the fallen angels. However, the yet future battle of Armageddon will not be the first. In the past, many battles ended up taking place in Megiddo, including one that took place during World War II. Megiddo just happens to lie between quite a few nations striving after world domination, and unlike most of the area surrounding Megiddo, the terrain is suitable for marching armies and mechanized warfare. However, the most significant battle to ever take place at that location was instrumental in bringing about the end of the Jewish nation forever. When God chose the sons of Israel as his special possession, he entered into an agreement with them to be their ruler, and they agreed to be his people. But as time went on, the nation of Israel rejected God and demanded a human ruler, and God gave them exactly what they wanted. The first king appointed to rule over Israel by God was Saul. Being a man, he soon succumbed to the intoxicating effect of power and became a typical political egomaniac. God then chose David as his replacement. But Saul refused to step down and in fact dedicated the entire military force of Israel to the task of hunting down and killing God's anointed King David. After David died, many kings represented the nation of Israel, but never again did God actually give Israel a king. However, many Bible prophecies speak of Israel always having a king in the line of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Jesse, and David. Jesus, being a descendant of all of these men, as well as all of the kings that descended from these men, would eventually be revealed as God's Christos, or chosen ruler, in fulfillment of all of those prophecies. Yahweh allowed many men to represent that part of the earth. He even altered events in such a way as to lead to rulers being chosen and other rulers being rejected. But according to the Bible, that would be true of all nations. Other than Saul, David, and Jesus, none of the kings that ruled in that part of the earth were ever chosen directly by God in the same way that Saul, David, and Jesus were chosen. After Solomon, not one of the kings of Israel was in the line of David. The nation split into two parts, and the nation itself began to be ruled by whoever had the most weapons and soldiers. In fact, as time went on, the nation was conquered by Assyria, and all of its citizens either exterminated or sold into slavery and replaced by a race of people known in the New Testament as the Samaritans. At that point, it should have been more than obvious that God would never again allow Israel to exist as a nation. But there were still those that held out hope that somehow Israel would one day rise to power again. Even with the majority of Israel destroyed and most of its people exterminated, there was still a remnant of the sons of Jacob living in the southern tip of the land, and among them was a descendant of David ruling over that people. And it just so happened that the temple around which most of Jewish life revolved was within the borders of this very tiny piece of land. The last king in the line of David to ever rule over anything that could be considered a sovereign nation was named Josiah. He never ruled over the 10 northern tribes of Israel, but only over the 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Between Egypt and Assyria was a highway that led right through Megiddo. King Josiah received a report that the Egyptians were marching to the defense of Assyria, which was at war with Babylon. So King Josiah took his army out to meet Pharaoh Necho II at the fortress that had been built on the hill spoken of in Revelation. There Josiah was killed, putting an end to any hopes that Israel may have held out of one day being restored as God's unified, independent nation again. From that moment on, the kingdom of Judah would be nothing but another vassal state of Satan's empire. Over the course of time, while under Egyptian rule, Pharaoh did appoint 3 men in the line of David as his vassal rulers over Judah, but no king in the line of David ever ruled over an independent nation again. Josiah's son Jehoahaz was chosen by the people to be king, but this only irritated Pharaoh Necho, who had him arrested and carried off to Egypt, where he lived out his days. When Yahweh freed the children of Israel from Egyptian bondage, he brought them into the promised land and gave them the freedom to rule themselves as an independent nation. All support for the belief that Israel could ever again regain that God-given privilege ended with the death of Josiah. In the yet future battle of Armageddon, all of the kings of the earth will be killed just as Josiah was killed by Pharaoh Necho, permanently putting an end to any belief system designed to support any of civilization's political schemes. Whatever support from God our current political leaders may have claimed to have had on the great day of God the Almighty, it will become more than obvious that such supposed support for a certainty no longer exists. Obviously, anyone reading the Bible, or even anyone that is aware of how the world works, would recognize that the vast majority of those sacrificed to the God of civilization have been more righteous than those doing the sacrificing. But it would be wrong to believe that the yet future sacrifice to be performed at Armageddon will follow the same pattern. Those who love their way of life have always had a deep sense of animosity for anyone refusing to participate in that way of life. Each of us has a built-in sense of right and wrong, but can usually justify any wickedness we are involved in with the proverbial excuse of everyone is doing it. The prophets have always stood as a constant reminder that, in fact, everyone is not doing it. It should be more than obvious that civilization has never provided for the needs of mankind, is not currently providing for those needs, and very obviously does not even have the means to ever provide for those needs. Rather than listening to the prophets sent by God, history records that it has always been standard operating procedure to simply kill such prophets. But when Jesus returns, he will not be here in support of the empire. His purpose for returning to the earth will be exactly the opposite of the God of civilization. Those sacrificed at Armageddon will be the ones that in the past would have been conducting the sacrifices. Before mankind can re-enter paradise, sacrifices must be made. But this time it will be those standing in opposition to paradise that will die. Not those of us who love God, not those of us who love living things, not those of us who love creation, and not those of us who love one another. The Israelites had more than adequate warning that their way of doing things was leading to all-out political, economic, and religious collapse. In around 935 BC, the kingdom became divided by a civil war. In around 910 BC, Yahweh sent Pharaoh Shishak to invade Judah and plunder the temple. And although the Bible does not catalog everything that Shishak stripped from the temple, we can be reasonably certain that among the items plundered was the Ark of the Covenant, as the Bible never again mentions its presence after 910 BC. And there are ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs showing Egyptian priests carrying something that looks exactly like the Bible's description of the Ark of the Covenant. Sometime around 740 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel was taken into captivity by the Assyrians, so it should not have taken the final remnant of the nation by surprise when in 609 BC, at the Battle of Armageddon, King Josiah, the final king of the nation, was killed, putting an end to Israel's God-given privilege of self-rule forever. In like manner, it should not surprise any of the citizens of any of the nations when, at the coming battle of Armageddon, all of the current kings of the earth or killed. For nearly 6,000 years, God has granted all of the citizens of this planet the freedom to engage in attempts at self-rule. Just as with the ancient nation of Israel, all attempts by all other so-called sovereign nations have failed, are currently failing, and will in the future fail. The battle of Armageddon that is soon to be upon us will bring an end to human self-rule forever. God's chosen ruler Jesus will take over rulership of the earth for 1,000 years, after which mankind will once again return to living in a paradise ruled over directly by the Creator. At John chapter 5 and verse 19, Satan is called the god of the world, the current god of civilization. And as discussed earlier, God is repeatedly called Eowa, which means to be, future tense. In English, Yahweh or Jehovah. But once Satan is removed from the vicinity of the earth, the Creator will become the absolute ruler of the earth. Never again will people be given a choice of which God to follow. As our Creator, only He is adequately qualified to know the best way for us to live. This planet was designed to function according to natural law. It cannot be modified to function according to the legalism of the nations. The two insurgents alongside of Jesus wanted freedom from Satan's rulership. Of the two, one ridiculed Jesus for not taking immediate action to free himself, while the other was able to figure out that only action from God could bring about true freedom. Both men died because they fought a war that they simply could not win. In the course of human history, millions have been sacrificed in mankind's struggle to keep civilization from failing. Under the control of the demons, most cannot even imagine a world ruled by the natural instincts put into human beings at creation. Patriots are those willing to fight to preserve a pre-existing political system or ideal. Revolutionaries are those willing to fight to replace a political system with what they perceive as a better one. Both understand that the only way to establish or defend their own personal form of government involves ritual human sacrifice in the form of carnal warfare. Jesus, as well as those of us who are humbly willing to follow his teachings, understand that no attempt at ruling ourselves separate from God has any chance of success. We are the ones spoken of at 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 51, who might never have to die at all. Even those who have been misled by Satan into participating in all of these wars for freedom will be there when this takes place. After all, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 52 says that those of us who never die will enter into the cloud to be with Jesus, and all of those resurrected, including that insurgent that was promised as much while dying next to Jesus. If we look back through time and carefully analyze why wars are fought, most of us would come to the conclusion that every war ever fought was motivated by nothing more than greed and lust for conquest. But if we had lived during those times, that would not have been the motivation of the actual combatants. Every soldier who has ever laid down his life for his country did so out of a desire to preserve his freedom and the freedom of his family. The Babylonian soldiers did not want their freedom taken away by the Egyptians, and the Egyptian soldiers did not want their freedom taken away by the Babylonians. In my lifetime, I have known men who fought against the Vietnamese because they truly believed in their hearts that if they did not conquer Vietnam, communism would take over the world. Today, young men and women are involved in conquering the Muslim world for the same reason. Anyone with any common sense at all would have to realize that the Vietnamese people never had any intention of conquering the world, and apparently the communists never really posed any threat either. When the Western world failed to win the war with Vietnam, nothing happened. As pointless as the Vietnam War was, and even more pointless as the war against Islam is, people are still concerned about freedom, and rightfully so. Because every war ever fought for freedom has, in all honesty, been fought to maintain mankind's freedom. Freedom from God. As human beings, our entire history has been devoted to one brutal war of conquest after another. Whenever one genocidal maniac dies or retires from office, another one always steps in to fill the vacancy. The lust for world domination is not an instinctive human trait, so we have to wonder why so many human beings are willing to kill one another in support of whatever form of government exists in whatever nation they just happen to arbitrarily be born into. People who study human governments have come up with many theories about why governments rise and fall, and have assigned names to the different forms of government that have been tried over the millennia since the first human pair rejected rulership by God. Interestingly enough, most of these titles are based on the ancient Greek language that was used to record the portion of the Bible known as the New Testament. I have studied the ancient languages from which our English Bibles have been translated quite intensely, so what I am about to tell you is not based on something that I heard on the internet. The books that I use in my studies are the same books used by those who represent themselves as being authorities on the subject of ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Most of the books in my library are well received and highly respected by academics and theologians alike. Some of the books that I use have been in circulation for well over 100 years. The three words that I'm going to speak about are all easy enough to look up for yourself online with nothing more than an English dictionary and the Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. They are all based on the same word form, and they all are based on words used extensively throughout the Bible. Those words are theocracy, autocracy, and democracy. According to our English dictionaries, a theocracy is any form of government ruled over directly by God or based on rules put in place by God. This is in agreement with the Greek definition of the words theos, Strong's number G, 2316, meaning God, and krateo, Strong's G, 2902, meaning to rule over or take possession of. Theokrateo, theocracy, ruled by God. According to our English dictionaries, the word autocracy means any form of government ruled over by one individual separate from the populace with absolute power, such as in a monarchy or dictatorship. The word autocracy comes from two Greek words, autos, Strong's number G, 846, meaning he, she, it, they, them, or those, and once again, krateo, meaning to rule over or take possession of. The English definition of this word is somewhat in agreement with the original Greek definition, to be ruled over by the one. He, she, it, they, them, or those. A single ruling entity separate from the population being ruled. Autokrateo, autocracy, ruled by one. According to our English dictionaries, a democracy is any form of government ruled over by a majority of the people, literally ruled by the crowd. The word democracy comes from the two Greek words demos, meaning crowd, and once again krateo, meaning to rule. But in this instance, I was unable to locate the word demos anywhere in the Bible. But I was able to locate a very similar word, daemon. Daemon, Strong's number G, 1142, is the word that in our Bibles is translated as demon. The full definition of the word daemon includes the words, any god less powerful than the true God, but more powerful than humans. Demokrateo, democracy, ruled by demons. In this instance, the English dictionary's definition of ruled by the crowds does not match the actual Greek definition found in any concordance or lexicon of the ancient Greek language as used in the New Testament. I double-checked every Greek reference book that I own to see if perhaps there is some other word from the ancient Greek language outside of the Bible meaning people, crowd, group, majority, multitude, or any other word related to human beings that includes any group of letters similar to those in the prefix demo. Within the Bible, the only words similar to demo that I was able to find are all similar in definition to the word daemon, such as daemonizomai, daemoeniodes, and daemonian, from which we get our English word dominion. All of the words I found, in all of their forms, include the word demon in their definitions, such as demonic, demon-possessed, and demon-like. If we only take into consideration the basic meaning of the word democracy according to the ancient Greek, then democracy can only mean ruled by demons. There is no way around it. But if we look at the actual Greek word that in the Bible is often translated as crowds, then we can see how democracy can mean ruled by the crowd. The word that often gets translated as crowds in our English Bibles is oklos, Strong's number G 3793. In the King James Bible, this word is translated as multitudes. This word is formed from the word echo, which means to possess, and is indicative of a group being directed by an owner, someone who possesses them. It is also defined as a vehicle, or as a second definition, a held group of people. The thought being that an oklos would be a group of people being directed as a single entity. It is similar to our word flock as it relates to sheep and goats. In the wild, groups of sheep and goats are referred to as herds. It is only when under the control of a shepherd that groups of sheep and goats are referred to as flocks. Vine's Expository Dictionary of New Testament Words has this to say under the entry for the word multitudes. Oklos, the common people in contrast with their leaders. An unorganized multitude in contrast to demos, the people as a body politic. After looking up this spelling of the word, demos, as it appears in Vine's, I was able to find a few articles stating that the word demos was part of the ancient Greek language from the time of Christ, separate and distinct from the spelling defined as demon. Since I knew that this spelling did not appear in any original Greek text produced by any of the 8 writers of the New Testament, I had to do some more research. When those writers spoke of the common people, they always used the word oklos. In fact, the word oklos appears 175 times in the Greek portion of the Bible. But when speaking of the ruling class or members of the ruling class, the Greek portion of the Bible always refers to them as either archon, Strong's number G 758, or protos, Strong's G 4413, or several other words completely unrelated to the word demos. One article that I came across about ancient Greek and Roman gods and governments stated that the word democracy was first used during the 4th century BC and quoted directly from documents from that time. In the article was a photograph of a sepulchre with a very obvious depiction of a female goddess placing a crown on the head of a male god. Beneath the illustration were the words Demokratia, placing a crown on the head of old man Demos. I have seen similar stone reliefs in my research over the years, and even though the names of the characters are always different depending on the culture, it is always the god of civilization being crowned by a goddess very closely resembling Isis, Ishtar, Astarte, Astartu, Venus, Juno, Diana, Hera, Mary the Mother of God, or any number of other mother goddesses. All of these are based on the relationship that existed between Eve and Satan. When Eve was told that she could be like God, she believed it and made have even craved it. She probably thought that the freedom of self-rule would be superior to being ruled by God. What she may not have fully understood at the time was that in order to break free from rulership by God, she had to obediently follow Satan's suggestion to do so, in effect, crowning him as her ruler. Self-rule, rule by the majority, from its beginning has always been rulership by the demons. The crowd, or multitudes, spoken of in the Bible, are the people who follow Jesus and his disciples in order to hear what he was saying. These crowds, or oklos, are the same people that Jesus miraculously fed. These crowds are the same ones that walked away when Jesus spoke about things that made them uncomfortable. These crowds are the same ones that, when asked by Pilate who to set free, yelled out, Barabbas. These crowds, or oklos, are the same ones who, when asked what to do with Jesus, yelled out, Crucify him! Crucify him! The crowd, who in the Bible are called the held, possessed, and directed people, the oklos, were very obviously held, possessed, and directed by the demons. How this is accomplished is why there is a difference between the daimons, deimos, and oklos. Remember that the first person to commit murder in the Bible was Cain, whose name in Hebrew means possession. Cain was himself the possession of Azazel, the brutal god of the brutal gods, Satan. Cain, by his actions, proved that he, just like the crowds in Jesus' day, just like the crowds in our day, was himself held, possessed, and directed by the demons. When those possessed crowds, or oklos, exercised their freedom by listening to Jesus, they were taking advantage of one of the benefits of democracy. We also did so at another occasion when they walked away as Jesus was teaching because they did not agree with what he was saying. When they cried out for Jesus to be tortured to death, they were again practicing democracy. Pilate, the ruler, did not make the decision to execute Jesus. As the ruler of a democracy, Pilate left that decision to the crowds. But unlike Vine's definition of oklos, meaning an unorganized multitude, the crowd that cried out for Jesus' execution was very much organized. They cried out with one unified voice. The Bible clearly states that they were being directed to do so by the religious leaders of the Jewish people. In our day, people will argue that Rome was not a democracy but a republic. Those same people will make the same argument today when speaking of Satan's current empire. There are literally hundreds of titles assigned to each and every human governmental system ever tried. These words were created by taking into consideration every perceived nuance of each and every human government that has ever been tried, and by human standards there are subtle differences between a democracy and a republic. But petty, hair-splitting arguments between people foolish enough to believe in the system doesn't mean a thing when you take into consideration what the true definition of democracy is. Since the Bible clearly shows that all of civilization is under the rulership of Satan, then every form of human government, whether it is called a democracy or called something else, must ultimately answer directly to Satan. Autocracy, which is rulership by a single person separate from the group being ruled, would have to, by definition, be rulership by a single demon-possessed person. Theocracy, which is defined as rulership by God, would have to be ruled by the God of civilization. Strong's exhaustive concordance defines theos as God, whether the true God or any other god or goddess, whether righteous or wicked. And for a fact, both within the Bible narrative as well as in literature outside of the Bible, the word theos is liberally used as the title of any and all gods spoken of in the ancient Greek language. A very simple explanation as to why the deimos, the ruling class, is distinct from the oklos, the possessed people, is not that difficult to figure out. The ruling class was directly possessed by demons. Jesus called the religious leaders of his day offspring of vipers, a direct reference to their father being Satan and his demons. Jesus never referred to the oikos or crowds by such a title. When speaking of the oikos, Jesus called them sheep without a shepherd. The oikos were very obviously owned or possessed by the ruling class, the demos. In general, it is still true that it is primarily the demos, or ruling class, that is directly possessed by the highest-ranking demons, the daemons. Direct possession by demons is why kings, prime ministers, presidents, popes, patriarchs, archbishops, bankers, chairmen of the board, CEOs, and other world leaders are so much more evil than the average person. Since the resurrection of the dead and restoration of the earth has yet to take place, it is very obvious that the God of civilization has as of yet not been replaced, meaning that no human government, religion, or economic system is currently under the guidance of Yah. For many listening to this information, it may be very difficult to accept that in the first century the Jews were practicing ritual human sacrifice. The Bible makes it very clear that this was the case, but the empire's religions, networks, public education systems, and other propaganda outlets have always intentionally avoided publicizing this information. Many argue that the story of Barabbas is a fiction, based on the fact that by Roman law Pilate was not allowed to release anyone sentenced to death for sedition. According to that law, to do such a thing supposedly could have cost Pilate his life. But if we look at the account as it is recorded in the Bible, that is not what happened. Jesus was not tried by the Roman authority, but by the Judean authority. The only reason that Pilate was involved at all was because the Jewish authority was not allowed to carry out death sentences. Pilate officially washed his hands of the entire affair and gave Jesus over to the oikos, in effect granting the Jews temporary authority to perform this particular execution without a conviction from Rome. Although we know that others were being executed that day, according to the account, Pilate did not allow the Jews to choose from the entire group, but only gave them the choice of freeing Barabbas or Jesus. Since the Jewish authority sentenced Jesus, it's only logical to conclude that Barabbas, like Jesus, had been sentenced by the Jews as well. All others being executed that day had in all likelihood been captured, tried, and sentenced by Rome, and as such did not qualify for the option of being released. The fact that Jesus, the Son of the Father, and Jesus, called the Chosen One, were both provided by the religious leaders of the Jews would fit in perfectly with the ancient ritual involving the ram for Azazel and the ram for the Lord. Calling Barabbas the Son of the Father would not have differentiated him from Jesus so much as to acknowledge his similarity to Jesus. Throughout the Bible, Jesus is repeatedly referred to as God's Son. A while back, one of my viewers asked me who the goat for Azazel was, and in response I immediately began to type out Jesus. After all, at John chapter 1 and verse 29, we are told that Jesus is the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. But when I thought about how the goat for Azazel was not sacrificed, that answer didn't make any sense. So I deleted my comment and simply said, I don't know. Later, another viewer sent me a comment indicating that she also believed that the goat for Azazel was Jesus. And that is when I started to do the research for this video. At John chapter 1 and verse 29, Jesus really is called the Lamb of God, but the verse does not say that he takes away the sins of the world, as the goat for Azazel did. The actual Greek words used in this passage are airo, hamartia, and cosmos. Airo is where we get our English word air and is used in the Bible when speaking of bringing things up out of the ground and into the open air, as in the resurrection of the dead, spoken of at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 17. This word is often translated as lifted up or raised up, in effect highlighting or exposing a thing in such a way so that everyone can see it. Hamartia is one of many words in the Bible that gets translated as sin, but this word actually has a much more detailed definition than simply sin in general. This word is the same Greek word used in archery to describe not hitting a target, literally missing the mark, a failure or shortcoming. And cosmos means civilization. A more accurate translation of John chapter 1 and verse 29 would be, look, the Lamb of God who exposes the shortcomings of civilization. Jesus means salvation of Jah. Both men being named Jesus highlights the importance of both the exiled ram and the sacrificed ram, both representing something essential for our salvation. At Armageddon, when millions of human beings are sacrificed, the demons inhabiting them will have nowhere to go. In effect, they will have no choice other than exile. Jesus and his righteous angels will fill the void when that takes place. After the resurrection, nobody will ever again be tricked into entering into any kind of covenant with any kind of angel. Natural law makes no exception for covenant law. The only agreement that any man will ever be able to enter into with God again will be the covenant to follow his natural law. Many verses speak of Jesus' death as a sacrifice. The churches would lead us to believe that his sacrifice was figurative. Nowhere in the Bible is there any reference to Jesus' death being any kind of figurative sacrifice. The religion of the empire quite literally sacrificed Jesus to the God of religion. Jesus was not killed because he was a criminal. He was not sacrificed to the true God. He was killed as part of the annual satanic ritual practiced by the Jewish faith. Quite soon, the final battle in this 6,000-year-long war between God's kingdom and Satan's empire will take place. Even now, millions of oppressed human beings are involved in a war of revolt against Satan's empire. Many others are contemplating joining them in that fight. At the same time, millions of patriots who are not willing to give up their lifestyle stand at the ready to defend the empire by any means necessary. At 2 Corinthians, beginning at verse 3, Paul wrote, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God for the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God." We are free to take a stand in defense of the empire if we feel compelled to do so, or we can take a stand against the empire as Barabbas and the two insurgents did on either side of Jesus at his execution. After all, while hanging there dying next to Jesus, one of the men asked Jesus to remember him when he entered into his kingdom, and Jesus replied by saying, "This very day I am saying to you, Amen. You will be with me in the paradise." I personally have chosen not to war against my fellow man, but instead to pray regularly for the spiritual strength to fight against the demons that are constantly trying to get us to take sides. The things that are being done by so-called insurgents sadden and enrage me. The things being done by so-called patriots sadden and enrage me as well. In this violent world, it would be very easy to take sides, especially for those directly affected. To those involved in the religions of Christianity, the story of Barabbas only records the fact that the crowds chose to release a crook over Jesus. Hopefully, those of you who have taken the time to listen to the information in this video realize that there is much more to be learned from this story. If you're wondering why this information has been hidden from mankind for so long, just understand that we are living at a very unique moment in time. All of the Bible's promises are about to come to fruition. In the past, it was not necessary for this information to be understood because in the past, nobody was going to experience what we as a people soon will. We are about to cross over from Satan's empire into God's kingdom, the paradise of God. Armageddon is God's means of overthrowing Satan's empire. We do not want to fall into the same trap that Peter fell into of believing that we can overthrow civilization with a machete. Even if we have an AK-47 and 1,000 rounds of ammo, we shouldn't consider our position to be superior to that of Peter 2,000 years ago. There are many videos available on the internet of hot, hungry, tired insurgents with considerably advanced weaponry being blown to bits by an enemy that they could not even see, often miles away, in an air-conditioned building with full bellies, sitting in very comfortable chairs in front of computer monitors. God promised that he would overthrow civilization. To attempt to do what God has said he would do could be considered as rebellion against God, or as elevating ourselves to the position of God. Certainly, it would at least show a lack of faith in his ability or desire to keep his word. Without the death of Abel, Cain would not have become an exile. The sacrifice of the goat for Yahweh would have had no value without the releasing of the goat for Azazel. In like manner, without the releasing of the Son of the Father, the sacrificing of the chosen one would not have had the same meaning. Without the sacrifice of Jesus, Barabbas would not have gone free at Armageddon. Those ruled by the demons must be sacrificed before the demons ruling over them can be exiled from the vicinity of the earth. Even though Jesus was often followed by the crowds, or oiklos, he was also followed by others not referred to by that title. The apostles, meaning messengers, and disciples, meaning taught ones. The churches often lead their crowds of or oiklos to believe that Jesus had 12 apostles or disciples, but that is not the case. There were 12 men that were associated with Jesus who were very special. These men were never given a title, but were usually just spoken of as the 12. But the number of those referred to as apostles and disciples was never recorded. When the final battle of Armageddon takes place, those of us willingly submitting to rule by God's chosen one will not be actively involved in the struggle to defend or establish some other form of rulership. Should we succeed in resisting the demons, we can be the ones spoken of within the pages of the Bible as those who shall witness the end of civilization with our own eyes. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.